to this Economic Society webinar. It's actually our first New South Wales webinar that we've had since the COVID crisis has changed everything in the society and the rest of the world. It will be recorded, so if you have friends and colleagues who've missed it, it should be on the Economic Society website later. My name is Paul Oslington. I'm Professor of Economics and Theology at Alpha Croesus College in Sydney. I'm chairing the forum today, and with me on our panel, our distinguished panel, Professor John Lodovics, who's Professor of Economics and Vice President Academic, SP Jain School of Global Management, Dr. Claire Wright, who's a postdoctoral research fellow in management at Macquarie University, and Professor Hugh Harley, University of Sydney. So I think on our panel, we've got tons of expertise, and we've got a variety of experiences too, a mix of academic and business background. People at different stages of their career. So I think we've got the stage is set for, I think, a really interesting discussion of the place of the history of economics in the economics profession and its future. A couple of things about how we're going to proceed today. We won't have questions that you can actually ask on the Zoom forum, because with the numbers we've got, that's not going to work well. But questions are really, the centre of what we're doing today. But if you have a question, and we'll have 15 minutes or so after the panel has gone around to take questions from participants, please stick your questions on the Q&A forum. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's two things. There's Q&A, so that's where you should put a question if you'd like us to deal with it in the last 15 minutes or so of our time together. And there's also the chat function. So the chat function's open to everyone. So if you want to make comments to each other or to us along the way, just general comments, stick them in chat. If you've got a question that you'd like us to deal with in the time at the end, stick it in the Q&A forum. So what we're going to do is go through a series of questions on the panel to start with, just to get the discussion going. And then we'll switch later on to take questions that you've put in the Q&A. So welcome again. Thanks for being a part of this important discussion of the current state and future prospects of the history of economics in Australia. So let's get going. Hugh, would you like to set the scene for us by giving us your perspective on how the economics profession in Australia is travelling at the moment, and especially in relation to the history of economics?
Sure. Thanks very much, Paul. And obviously a question about the shape of the profession is a little bit an eye of the beholder question or perspective. But let me just kick off with some comments. I think there are lots of reasons for thinking that the profession's in pretty good shape at the moment, actually. I mean, just look at how economists and chief economists have colonised the corporate world in a way that would have been unthought of 30 years ago. Student enrolments in economics across the tertiary sector are doing pretty well. I mean, for instance, I know at the University of Sydney that Economics 1 has become the single most popular course in the university. I've only recently returned to academia. I've spent most of the last 30 years in the corporate world, most of the last 10 years working in the financial centres across the globe. And I can say that the Australian economics profession is punching above its weight and regarded as punching above its weight, helped in part by the fact that there's no doubt in those circles that the Reserve Bank here is regarded as absolutely in the top tier, the top cup of central banks, and the Australian policy sector is regarded in the same way. So we all get a bit of inherited glory from that. But I think there are lots of positives on that front. I think the broader question is not so much about economics in Australia, but economics everywhere. And that is, how fit for purpose are we for the challenges of 2020 and beyond? I think if and particular, in each of our individual stovepipes, we're probably doing pretty well. But the question is, are we really disseminating the new insights across the stovepipes? We're thinking about the implications of behavioural economics, for instance, of biophysical economics. It's really the eternal questions for economics. Should we be broad or should we be deep? And I suppose to bring it back then to this question. I mean, personally, I was brought up in a tradition of being a broad church economist. It's the combinations of insight you get from the different perspectives that's really valuable. I certainly found, having been more of a broad rather than a deep economist, that was a comparative advantage in the corporate world. And in terms of the history of economic thought, part of the reason that I've always been passionate about that is I think it's, apart from the intellectual value of it, I think it's a very tractable vehicle to introduce students to the breadth of economics and different perspectives in economics. And I think that's a huge part of its value. I also think the same, perhaps even more so, about economic history as a great vehicle. And that's economic history as in the history of economies rather than the history of economic thought. That's a great vehicle as well for introducing students to that breadth. And in fact, most of my teaching now at Sydney is in economic history. And look, I think to cut to the chase, there's no question that in the last couple of decades, both the history of economic thought and economic history have been in retreat. And I think that's disappointing. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that's to follow around those issues.
At Sydney, Hugh, I know the course is still going. Peter Groenewegen famous Economic Classics course. Now that I think you took, I think, when you were at Sydney.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was lucky that I was taught by Peter Groenewegen. Peter was clearly, a global scholar in the history of economic thought, and that tradition is still very much alive at Sydney. There's both a third year and a fourth year course in the history of economic thought, and lots of others are involved in it. So but it's not a Sydney issue here. I think it's the broader issue that the profession overall has moved away both from the history of economic thought and economic history, and I think that comes at a cost.
Yeah, well, I mean, looking around the country, there's history of economic thought courses still running at UWA, still running at a couple of other universities, but historians of economic thought are a bit of an endangered bunch at the moment. There are very few new appointments in the field. There are few PhD students working in the history of economics in Australia. Courses are under threat, and I think while it's still going at Sydney, the future is unclear. The Centre for History of Economic Thought, for instance, is now defunct at Sydney. It's the outlook across the country for the history of economics is not strong. I think my sense is that, and others, John and Claire, may want to come in on this too, that economic history is in a bit better shape across the country than the history of economics.
I mean, I think potentially if you just accounting it by number of appointments or number of new appointments, and potentially also the age profile, then maybe it's in better shape. But I think also, and I'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, that there's some sort of institutional reasons why economic history might be having a little bit more going on.
Sure. So that's just a very brief sense of where we stand at the moment And some of the readings, which I hope you've got if you're participating, that went around with the invitation, there's a bit more information in some of those readings on the current state of the field, and John particularly has written on that, along with Alex Milmau, who's a president of the History of Economic Society of Australia, has also written a little bit on that topic recently. But let's move to why we care about this. Now, I guess that's why the four of us are spending our Thursday lunchtime doing this. And we care about the history of economics and the contribution that it can make to the economics profession in Australia. My own view is that the history of economics is an important thing in itself. But also, I think it's important for the economics profession. I think some exposure to the history of economics can balance the rest of your economics education, can convince you that that Menke or whatever textbook you're using in your course didn't drop from the sky as the revealed and inerrant truth, that the economics that you're studying evolved in a particular context in response to particular pressures. And I think that sense of what economic theory, what the current consensus is, that it's contingent, it's fallible, can really help you be a better economist. It's not, studying the history of economics is not a rejection of the current consensus in economics necessarily, but I think it can help you to understand much more deeply and be a much better user of the economics that you're being taught, or the economics that you're using in your research. So I think both in itself, it has a value, and I think as a contribution to economics education, it'd be a great loss for the profession if research and teaching in the history of economics died. I don't know whether John or Hugh or Claire have any reflections I'd like to add on the value they see in the history of economics for economic researchers and economic teaching.
Well, I mean, let me just jump in there, Paul, and repeat the point I made earlier. Right? I think that breadth is incredibly important in economics, and I think that there are many ways to get that, but I think the history of economic thought is definitely one way. Particularly when it comes to some of the critical texts. I mean, The Wealth of Nations comes to mind. I mean, it is extraordinary the impact that one book had on the development of the modern world. I mean, clearly changes in society and the economy were a fertile ground, and in a sense, at one level, Smith was catching up with things. In another level, it fed directly in a fundamental change in the operation of the law, for instance, in the operation of contract law. On a different note, I was reading the other day about the history of medicine in Australia, and that made a huge point about how the Wealth of Nations impacted the very way in which it had a monumental effect. And unless people don't pick that sort of thing up, that 200 years later, without it being taught. And I think those sorts of insights are critically important.
I'd just like to add as well that most of the leading economists in the profession have had some interest, even if it's just a hobby, in the history of their own discipline. I think it makes you a much better, well-rounded economist to be aware of whose shoulders you're standing on and the contributions that have been made in the past. And I think it's regrettable that some economists claim they're being very innovative and presenting something new, only to later discover that this was all said many, many years ago.
Look, I agree, John, and I think that one of the key contributions, and I think, Paul, you touched on this as well, is realizing that not very much, like everything is built within a context. And so new ideas, you're not necessarily moving from worst to best practice. It's just dependent on the context and the particular framework that you're working with and that sort of thing. And so having an understanding of, say, Keynesian theory would have been very helpful in, say, 2009 or 10. And if you had just come from a neoclassical framework, then that might not have been, you might not have had the right policy response.
One of the things that I mean, a lot of my work at the moment is interdisciplinary, working across economics and theology and philosophy. And I think one of the things that history does is it's a really nice bridge between disciplines, that whether you're a philosopher, an anthropologist, a business leadership person or whatever, your discipline has a history. So I think history can be a really nice place to have conversations between disciplines. I've certainly found that in my own work. Now, Claire, one of the things that we've touched on briefly is this distinction between the history of economics and economic history. You work in both. Do you want to set us straight on the differences between the two?
Sure. Yeah, as you said, I do work in both areas, and I find quite a lot of overlap between them. But look, the simple answer is that the history of economic thought is primarily about ideas and how people have written and thought about the economy, and economic history is about the progress of the material aspects. So how did unemployment progress, what industries have been important, and so on. So they're distinctive because one's about ideas, the other's about action. But I think it's key to remember that what we see in the economy is essentially just the culmination of individual decisions made within a certain sort of institutional context. And those individual decision making is guided by this internal logic and the ideas that each person has. And further, the institutions that you operate in are also guided by a certain logic and a certain idea. And so at each stage, the material realities of living in the economy and how people think about the economy are really just two sides of the same coin. And I think a really good place where they come together is in economic policy. So, of course, any policy is designed with a particular ideas in mind. So how we think the world works or what we want to achieve. You might have a Keynesian, neoclassical, communist perspective about that. And then that policy is enacted and integrates with the material economy and affects how people live and work. And so it goes from being part of the history of thought to part of what we would call economic history. So they are distinctive, but I think that there's like a really good combination of the two.
Good, thanks, Claire. But one of the reasons that we're doing this is that now there are concerns about the future of the history of economics, in particular in Australia. John, this is a topic that you've written a little bit about. Would you like to offer your perspective on why the history of economics has been declining in recent years, particularly at a teaching level in Australian universities, but also I think at a research in the history of economics in Australia? Have you got some reflections on that, John?
Thanks, Paul. Look, it is surprising what's happened to the history of economic thought in this country when you realise that Australians have a wonderful reputation, an international reputation for the quality of the work they do in the history of economics. There are not many other fields, sub-disciplines of economics where we can make that claim. It'd be interesting to hear from some of the audience where they think that Australia makes a highly significant and is recognised for making a significant contribution to the economics profession. Time ago, They did that in international trade with people like Murray Kemp, Trevor Swan, Max Corden. Aren't too many areas anymore. Also in agricultural economics, we were very well known. Aren't too many areas anymore that we have this reputation. But in history of economics, we do. We have produced some outstanding historians of economics, and they are widely applauded for their work internationally. So it's a bit of a surprise that as to what has happened to the history of economics. So why has it happened? Well, some obviously interest in the history of economics declines, as it does for any aspect of economics when the economics profession as a whole declines. And we know quite clearly there's less interest in economics in the high schools. We know that at the tertiary level, economics departments have been closed or merged or moved over into arts or dominated by business. We know that there are less Bachelor of Economics degrees, less compulsory economic subjects. So it stands to reason that also history of economic thought was affected. But we don't only need to focus on Australia. We also know that the history of economic thought has declined in America. It's declined in Europe. So it's declined everywhere. So it's not just an Australian phenomenon. Why has it happened? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the way that the profession has changed over time. There was a long period of time when economics became more abstract, more mathematical. Some people call it the Americanization of the profession. And the main purpose was to try to get published in top-ranked journals, and to do that, you needed to write in a particular style. And there were less and less opportunities for those that took a historical perspective to publish in those journals. Now, mind you, in the old days, not that long ago, the 1960s, Australian historians of thought were publishing in all the leading economics journals. That doesn't happen anymore. I think the other thing that's happened too, and if I can be a little bit more controversial, is that as we've opened up higher education to more and more students, we have attracted a sort of student that has the attention span of a goldfish, who reads nothing but texts on their phone, and who is incapable of sustained concentration and reflection, which are the sort of the characteristics that you need to do the history of economics. So students have voted with their feet, and they've moved away not only from analytical subjects like economics, but for reflective historical subjects as well. In particular, the history of economics has been affected by two very severe challenges. One is that back in 2007, there was a reclassification of research fields, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the history of economics didn't belong in economics anymore. In fact, it belonged in history, archaeology, religion, and philosophy. So they tried to take it out of economics. Luckily, we defeated that. And then in 2013, when it came to journal rankings, there was a concentrated effort by the Australian Business Deans Council to downgrade journals in the history of economics. Luckily, that was defeated as well. So we've certainly faced some challenges, but it's clearly the case that the history of thought is a very aging community in Australia, and less subjects in the history of economic thought survive. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, Paul and John, I suppose I'd make the overarching point too, that in many ways over the last 30 years, the whole world has moved away from history generally.
Yes, quite right.
Right. There's been a sense that there's so much change, so much is new, so much progress has been made that, you know, the insights of history are not as valuable as they used to be. it's not going to surprise anyone in the audience that I don't share that view, and it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves from here. But I think we've got to understand that there's the whole, this is a global phenomenon, not just related to economics. Mm. And, you know, those of us who do think that the past contains valuable lessons for the future, you know, have to think about how to respond to that. I'm not sure I'd agree with you, John, entirely. I know directionally the point you're making about different student interest, right? But at the end of the day, it seems to me the obligation on us as teachers is to make this stuff interesting and digestible and for the students. I mean, holy cow, we're talking about how the bloody hell we got here, right? And if we can't make that interesting, then you know, we need to think hard about what to do differently. And you know, I mean, I think one of the really exciting things that we can point to over the last 20 years is how is the interplay between sophisticated data analysis techniques and the application, you know, to historical data to produce incredibly insightful reflections on how we got here. So, you know, there are plenty of challenges, but at the end of the day, we've got to be passionate about the fact that this is incredibly important for every dimension, you know, including the next generation who are going to be the leaders of the future, who are going to be the policymakers of the future, and help them digest some of these insights.
Oh, very true, Hugh. Engaged teaching is so relevant. But I think you do have to make a distinction between the students that you have in the GO8s and students in other universities that may be much more vocationally oriented.
No, look, I absolutely get the point, John. I get the point. And I mean, I talked about a broad church earlier, and clearly, you know, that sense of broad church has many different dimensions, including the cohort of students today. It is much broader in all sorts of ways than it was when I was a student 40 years ago. And you know, we've got to think about that, and how to tailor, you know, to those different audiences at the end of the day.
Yeah, and my own experience has been having a shot at history of economics in a first year unit, and I think that's a very different to the sort of elite history of economics course at the upper level or honours level. You know, I think that is a demanding thing that requires intensive reading, you know, pretty highly developed skills. But I think too, you know, I think there's a place for that, and I just so treasure that in Australian economics education. You know, it's many of our top people in academia or who've gone on to the business world, and you could list them, you know, particularly, you know, it seems historians of economics have ended up in the upper end of finance in Australia. But I think the other end too, where the history of economics can be really useful in a standard introductory course. You know, it's a way of motivating students, a way of making economics less of a series of propositions about the world and more of a story about the world, the way the world is. You know, history is a story, and I think, you know, we can think about ways to do the history of economics, you know, with a bit of a different student body to the elite GO8 student body that has been the traditional market for historians of economics. Any other reflections on, you know, why we've why we're in the position we are now with the history of economics, you know, under so much threat in Australia?
I might just answer your question with another question. Do we ever talk to historians? And should we?
Well, dearie me, Claire, we're economists.
But surely, you know, like that reflection that you had about the fact that introducing students to history of economics through first year units could also apply to introducing them to that at a first year history basis as well. So potentially there's some work to be done there, but that's for later in the panel.
Sure. Well, let's keep moving because we do want to leave plenty of time for questions from our participants. John, one of the things that I've heard about the history of economics is that we don't need the history of economics because the history of economics is just a game where people who don't like mainstream economics can find a niche to bag the mainstream, to tear down the mainstream. So the history of economics is it's not just a luxury item that needs to go from the curriculum, but it's actually something which is a threat to mainstream teaching and research in economics. I know you've written a little bit on this in the past. Is that a valid concern that the history of economics is something which is actually a threat, undermines the work of mainstream economists?
Oh, Paul, that's a very controversial issue. I mean, the concept of a broad church has been mentioned a few times. History of economics has always been a broad church. At our conferences in Australia and overseas, we have always been welcoming to those who may not strictly be historians of economics, but who do teach in the heterodox tradition. So we've always welcomed the Austrians, those that want to make contribution in Austrian economics, Austrian approaches to economics. At the other end, to Marxists, to radical political economists, to post-Keynesians and Sraffians and neo-Ricardians and all sorts of strange and wonderful groups. They have their own circles to talk in, but they're usually very small circles, and they are usually not invited to speak at other forums. But we have always opened the door and appreciated their input and their contributions. So we have been a broad church in that sense. I guess also the history of economics attracts those people with minds that are more philosophical, less mathematically inclined, more policy oriented, or those that just like to raise uncomfortable questions. And of course, the heterodox community do that. Now, in Australia in particular, we have been blessed, in inverted commas, with academics who wear two hats. Many very good historians of economics are also very good heterodox economists. So they wear two hats. Now, I guess it's a blessing, but what that means is that there's some guilt by association. Okay, you people then get the impression that, look, historians of economic thought, all they do is say things which are hostile to the profession. They're hostile to standard economics. So there's that association. There does not need to be that association. Yes, some historians of thought are critical of the profession and how it has changed over time, but many other historians of economic thought have been influential drivers in the progress of economics. One thinks of, say, John Creedy from Melbourne, for example, or the work of Sam Hollander. There have been lots and lots of historians of economic thought that have been totally consistent with the standard approaches to economics. So it's not necessarily true that historians of thought are hostile to the profession. History of economics can be used to defend or to criticize contemporary economics from a historical perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Now, I think one of the things that's interesting about the history of economics is that so much more history is being done closer to of things that are closer to the present time.
Yeah.
We've got excellent histories of game theory, histories of behavioural economics, which are trying to put those recent developments in context to help us to understand those important parts of the mainstream more thoroughly. I think that's some of the most interesting work in the history of thought going on at the moment. Okay, one of the things that I wanted to raise was in trying to understand what's going on with the history of economics. I think it's helpful to think about the history of economics in relation to the history of business or the history of science. And Claire, I know that you're actually in a management department at the moment, and your current research is as much on the history of business and management as it is on the history of economics, although your PhD was very much the history of economics. Do you have any reflections on how the state of the history of economics compares with the history of science, the history of management thought, and other related fields?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. As you said, I have worked in, economics, history of science, and management. And I'm not very far into my career, so who knows what's next. But look, there's a simple answer and a not simple answer. The simple answer is that my impression is that the history of economics lies somewhere in between the sort of vitality of the history of science and the history of management. I think part of this is related to the age of the parent discipline, so which then feeds into how much the discipline thinks about itself. So science disciplines are quite long-standing, and so they have relatively more conversations about their practice and how it's changed over time. In economics, that's kind of somewhere in the middle, but management is quite contemporary, and so there's been much less of the where have we come from stuff, simply by a factor of age and sort of level of professionalism in the parent discipline. But in every place that I've worked, that particular group thinks they're hard done by. And that's not to say they're not hard done by, but it's to say that, economists feel hard done by compared to, say, business. History of economic thought feels hard done by compared to economics. Management actually feels hard done by compared to like STEM, and history of science probably feels hard done by compared to science. And so there is this sense that we don't necessarily know how good / bad we have it from within the thing, within history of economics. And also that there are quite a lot of people in these other areas with whom we could be working. So I'm doing some work at the moment on sort of corporate history, and I am finding that's a really nice way of combining history of economics and history of management. And I'm able to talk to those people about my work. And so rather than comparisons, I think that we should see them as sort of fellow travelers on our journey.
Claire, the other one I'd call out is law and the history of law, which I think's, both obviously a very important discipline in its own right. But I think economists ignore the law probably too much. It's too much of a closed book. And yet, so much of early economic history is really captured in early legal history. I mean, effectively, law was the initial vehicle of economic policy. When there was the Black Plague in England in 1349, they introduced the statute of labourers basically to reduce mobility in the labour market. And there's just enormous insight captured in the law that could be of relevance to understanding how economics and economies have evolved. And if there's anyone in the audience wondering, how can I find a place to really make my mark, then one of my pieces of advice would be, delve into the history of law and build connections and use that as an engine for helping to shed light on economic development.
Good. Thanks, Hugh. Well, we're moving closer to the time where we'll switch over to questions from the audience. But before we do, we might just go around our panel and have a minute from each of us on what we'd like to see the future of the history of economics looking like in Australia. I guess that we think there is a future. We've bothered to turn up for the panel. We think there is hope for the history of economics, and we think it can make a really positive contribution to the economics profession in Australia. But let's just go around our panel and hear from everyone about what they see as the way forward for the history of economics in Australia. John, do you want to start us off?
Oh, look, probably reflecting my advanced years, I don't have the optimism of youth. I'm fairly pessimistic about the chances of a resurgence, a revival of the history of economic thought. We are a very aging cohort, and we've been the subject to external factors and that have affected our success. And also there's plenty of room for self-criticism as well. For example, we have not been able to attract many females into the study of the history of economics, which has been very disappointing. Having said that, whenever the economy faces some severe external shock or crisis, then all of a sudden, when established thinking is unsettled, as it was with the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, and maybe the pandemic now, then people do start to go back in the past and see what, if any, value can be gleaned from similar episodes in the past for current application. So I do think that if these external shocks continue, there may be more opportunities to ransack the past for possible policy options. I mean, in the current environment where interest rates are so ridiculously low, where people have even experienced negative interest rates, it seems to me a lot of the Austrian thinking is very relevant. The misallocation of resources that occurs in a very low interest rate environment, the lessons, the warnings that the Austrians have given us seem to have been forgotten very quickly. But finally, I think we as historians of thought, at least the younger ones, need to demonstrate to their colleagues that what they're doing is not only interesting, I think we can show it's very interesting, but is relevant for contemporary economics. So new approaches, and Paul mentioned a number of those, and Claire's own work exemplifies that. If we can work in areas to increasingly demonstrate the value we contribute, our value add, then we have more opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Hugh, do you want to give us your reflections on
look,
what the future looks like?
Sure. I mean, the short answer for me is, and I've said this already, I think both the history of economic thought and economic history are fantastic vehicles to energise the next generation. Ultimately, to me, that's the personal strategy. Use the classes you teach to introduce kids to these issues and get them excited. I mean, I teach a first year undergraduate course on the Australian economy, and I devote about 40% of that to the picture from roughly 1700 to roughly 2100. To tell them that story, and to include in that a potted history of the history of economic thought as part of that. So, to me, that's the strategy. I can't speak for others, but that's the personal strategy. I make the other point too, that at one level, all econometrics and economic statistics is really just economic history and numbers, right? Whether it's short-term or long-term, right? So it doesn't just have to be you know, a reading and writing sort of discipline. As I said, I think there's some incredibly exciting work about that. But ultimately, you know, you either do or don't believe that history remains incredibly relevant to the modern world and the future. And if you're passionate about that, then you've just got to find ways to excite students and convince your colleagues.
Thanks, Hugh. And Claire?
Look, I'll agree with John and Hugh with what they've said. I think my aim is for a very integrated and interdisciplinary future for history of economics. I think there's enormous opportunities for scholarship, PhD students, undergraduate teaching and that sort of thing in economics, but also in other areas. And by not integrating with those other areas, I think we're doing the profession and the field a disservice. So that would be my answer. Thanks.
Sure. My own view of this, I think, has a lot in common with what others have said. I certainly agree with you, Claire, that we need to spend more time with the general intellectual historians, the history of science people, the history of management people. I think, particularly given Australia is so small, we can't afford to, just as historians of economics, just talk to economists and that's it anymore. I think we have to get out into the, get out a bit more. But a personal view is that I think at a research level, now there's a real place for a centre for the history of economics to be established or re-established. I mean, we've lost the centre at Sydney. There are some discussions going on about a centre at UWA, some discussions about things in other places. But I think really, if at a research level, if the history of economics is going to survive in Australia, we have to have some sort of a centre, to focus efforts. Now, with it being under threat in universities across the country, I think a research focus that will pull together, scholarship, get that sort of critical mass that we need, to win ARC grants, and History of Thought has got a pretty good record in that. To win ARC grants, to establish a viable PhD program in Australia, I think we really do need to pull resources together and focus it in some sort of research centre. But I think the answer is a lot of what Claire was saying too, of getting out more into together with the related fields. I mean, Australia's got really good, Sydney has really good history of science and general intellectual history. There are strengths in history of management, labour history, other things around Australia that offer opportunities for historians of economics. But anyway, I'm conscious of the time, and let's switch now over to some of the questions. I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A, so if you have further questions, the Q&A forum is where to put them, but I'll just pick out some of them now and put them to our panel. So one of the questions here is about specialisation from Thomas Emery. So it's a question about if just a few universities specialise in history of thought. Is this a good thing because it will dilute the study in other universities around the country? What do you think about this issue about concentration versus trying to maintain the history of economics broadly in a lot of universities? Any reflections on that question?
Well, Paul, it's also it's a much broader issue than that. Many areas in the humanities and the arts and the social sciences have contracted to the GO8s. They have left the regional universities, the smaller universities, and it's partly a reflection of our demand-driven system, where more and more students have gone into higher education, but they vote with their feet with the sort of subjects they really want to study. So it's a much broader question than just history of thought.
I mean, the other issue with this is sort of allocation of resources. And Paul, you were saying that there's it's necessary to have some sort of collective action in order to make things happen. And so if you have some places that have a research centre or have a particular strength in history of economic thought and those sorts of things, that can be really helpful. Like rather than just having like one person at every university, which might not provide the level of like clustering that you might need to have successful ARCs and that sort of thing. So in some ways it can be really good.
I mean, I think overseas, something like the Centre at Duke University has been a real focus for historians of economics in the US and broadly than the US. There's a critical mass of people in London around Mary Morgan and Tiago Marta and others. There's a strong group in the Netherlands, now in Amsterdam. So I think there is I think that we need to replicate that in Australia to survive. So my vote would certainly be on concentration for the survival. Okay. We've got a few questions about the specifically Australian situation, about university budgets and other things, but I might go to a really interesting question that Nitul Deshpande has asked about, and I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Nitul, but an interesting question about what we actually cover when we're talking about the history of economics or economic history. Is it just recent Western history, or should we get in, as she suggests, to ancient Greece, China, and India, rather than just concentrating on 19th and 20th century Western economics? Any thoughts on that? Is it too narrow? Are we losing people because our focus is too narrow as historians?
I mean,
well, let me jump. Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
Sure, yeah.
Look, I mean, Nitul, I absolutely couldn't agree with you more. I mean, to go back to personal strategies, I mean, my pitch to return to the University of Sydney after being away for 35 years was basically, let me teach a postgraduate course on 1,000 years of global economic history, tell the story from woe to go over 1,000 years. And so, I'm absolutely in the space that we need that sort of perspective. I mean, the standard story of economic history is nothing to happen to 1750 and then everything happened overnight and here we are. And of course, it was a much longer picture than that. I sort of, for convenience sake, I restrict myself to 1,000, starting around 1000 AD. The average income per head in China was roughly twice what it was in England. By 1500, India was right up at the top, and of course things have changed. And so telling that whole story, and partly about the economics, and partly about the philosophy and the economic history, and partly about the law. I think it's a fertile ground, and I made the point before. The innovative use of statistical methods to long-term problems has been phenomenal. We now have annual estimates of English and then British GDP from 1270. Detailed estimates. It's extraordinary. And that work that you've now got a similar series for the Netherlands, for Spain, for Italy. This stuff is exploding. There was a very famous article in the QJE, roughly 15 years ago, I think, that showed the incredible correlation between anti-Jewish pogroms following the Black Death by location, and the coincidence of that during the Second World War. In other words, confirming that those cultural biases effectively had a 600-year history, right? Now, again, if we can't get students interested in that sort of stuff, then, you know, frankly, I think we've got to look pretty hard at ourselves.
Look, I agree, and I think decolonizing the history of economic thought curriculum is a key way of not only, you know, coming into the 21st century and the way that students want to learn about particular subjects. I think that would be a really important step to make, because we accept that the orthodox economics is not the only way to do things. Surely we should also accept that Western economics is not the only way to do things. So I think it's a really important step that we should make.
Good, thanks. I was just going to make almost the same point, Claire, that you was talking very much about you know, comparative economic history, but I think it's just as true of economic thought that, you know, economic problems occur in all places of the world, you know, through all of history. And I think, you know, looking at the way other people, you know, who aren't you know, rich Westerners of the last couple of centuries, look at these issues can help us to understand, you know, our own situation, our own way of thinking, you know, so much better. So I think we have resounding votes for broadening the range of the history of economics. We've probably got time for one more question. And there's lots of interesting questions here. It's hard to choose. I might go with this one from Mahid. Do we think economics issues are resolved?
Hope not. I mean,
so you're suggesting, Claire, maybe that one of the things history of economics can teach us is that is in fact that things are never resolved.
No, and that you know, we're surely, if things are resolved, then we have to accept the world the way it is, and surely what we're put here to do is to try and make things better. You know, we'll never get to a place where we're perfect, and so I think by continually trying to improve or bring in different perspectives, or you know, think differently about the way we do things, then we can kind of achieve a better world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the simple ways I try to introduce students to those issues is to look at the equals sign in economics. You know, I mean, effectively it has at least three uses, right? It's equals as an identity. And so in that sense, something is solved, you know, I mean, settled, that people accept that ex ante, I equals S, for instance, right? There's equals as a functional relationship, you know, C equals some constant fraction of Y, for instance. And that, of course, is something that changes both in, you know, in how we think about it as economists and what the underlying stats might be. And then there's equals as an equilibrium, you know, an equilibrium condition, which of course goes to how we think about economics, and that's certainly not settled. So, you know, I mean, I think there are some things we get settled, like identities, but not much more after that.
Well, in economics, we talk about constrained optimization, and we all would like to achieve certain objectives, but the constraints can be very severe. They restrict what we can achieve. I'll just give one very simple example. The ABS, in the recent research reclassification, has taken development economics out of economics. Anyone who is doing research and classifies themselves as a development economist is now not regarded as being in the field of economics. It's been taken out of economics completely. Now, we've
put?
talked about the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. That was the start of economics. Development economics is now no part of economics. A decision made by an external body that's deprived us of an essential component of our discipline.
Well, we've run out of time. I think that last discussion was kind of interesting. I think everyone on this panel recognises the importance of resolving things in one sense. If you're solving an economic model, or you're doing rigorous empirical work, we're not suggesting that is without value, or that somehow the answers are fuzzy and don't really matter, or something like that. But I guess it's the strong view of everyone on the panel that alongside rigorous theory, careful empirical work, that the history of economics and the history of the economy are really important topics that should not be lost from economics teaching and research in Australia. So thanks very much to John and to Claire and to Hugh on our panel, and thanks to everyone too who's participated today and offered some really interesting questions. I'm sure I'm happy to carry on the conversation by email or whatever, and other panel members are pretty easy to track down too if you want to continue these discussions. But yeah, thanks everyone on the panel and who's participated today for your interest in the topic, and we'll bid goodbye from our Economic Society webinar. And keep a lookout on the Economic Society website for upcoming webinars. I know there's some really good stuff on COVID and monetary policy and a few other things coming up on the webinars. So keep an eye out on the Society website and on your email inbox for future webinars. Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.